I am here to offend all of you.
That's the gospel that we preach. That's the gospel that we need. And that's the gospel that's more than enough.
Man, it's great to meet you.
Yeah, nice to meet you too. How you doing, Jordan?
I'm doing well. How are you doing today?
Doing well.
Awesome. So,
Gotcha.
you've been a member of the same church your whole life. Is that right?
Yes, sir. I came here when I was 7 years old. My dad and mom had gotten a divorce, and I met my stepmom about a year after that, and she brought me to church, and then I'm still in the same church.
Yeah. And you're the pastor of that church.
Yeah. Just celebrated my 20th year as the pastor. Started in January of 2006.
Brother, thank you for your faithfulness to the ministry. What I'd love for you to talk about as far as that goes is maybe, we live in a culture where people church hop constantly. What keeps you rooted there? And that long in the same church, I'm not going to pretend to assume that it's just the perfect church, but rather you've just probably stuck it out. So could you talk a little bit about that?
Well, I want to first say I appreciate the encouraging words. I'm here because God has seen fit to keep me here. And in as far as my faithfulness, I'm thankful that He has been faithful in keeping me in the same place for a long enough time that I feel like I have been able to actually make impact. I think a lot of times guys will leave and they move on to another church, and they may have just been on the verge of making an impact. And I'm not saying that's every person. I think guys leave for all kinds of different reasons. And I know I have a lot of pastor friends who have a lot of difficult stories that they share. In fact, my wife just finished doing a podcast of her own where she talks with women pastors, or not women pastors. Let me back that up. Women pastors' wives, and she talks to pastors' wives about the diffiferences of being a minister's wife.
It's the pink shirt, brother.
Yeah, I know. I came in representing the Methodists today. So forgive me. But no, so there's a difficulty. Ministry is difficult. I have a little syllogism. I say ministry is people are hard, therefore ministry is hard. And yet, so God has seen fit to keep me here. And I think part of the reason why is because we had so much that needed to change, and we're not a perfect church, and we but I hope to think that we're biblically functioning. I hope that we function according to Scripture. That's our goal, is to be a biblically functioning church, and that's why I wrote the book. And so as far as to the question of longevity and things, it really is just recognizing that there is a goal you're going for. You're never going to reach it, and you can't let the setbacks and disappointments keep you from moving forward. And the question, remind me again exactly how you worded the question, because I want to make sure I'm answering it properly. So you asked me.
Yeah, it's just what keeps you rooted. What should keep members rooted in a church when culture is kind of saying it's okay to church hop when you feel that your needs are not being met, or for any other number of reasons why people would leave a church that isn't a good reason.
Well, I think sometimes we get very consumer minded when it comes to church, and most of the people that I know of that leave churches for one of two major reasons. Either there's some type of interpersonal conflict. I talk about this in the book. There's either some type of personal conflict that leads to a division, wherein in many of those situations it should have been either church discipline or reconciliation or counseling that just didn't happen. And so that's probably a lot of them. But on the other side, I think people become fascinated with what other churches offer, and it becomes very much an issue of I want what my church doesn't have, whether it is something for my children, or something for me, or something for my spouse, or it's my church is no longer filling my need, and rather than looking for ways to invest in the church that you're in, it's easier to go to a church that already has those things in place. It's like the proverbial situation where the young person is at the church and they say, well, I'm going to leave this church because there's no young people here. And then what's the response? Well, if you leave, there's going to be no young people here. There can't be young people if every time young people come, they leave. And likewise, the same thing goes for any number of other categories of people.
Great. So when should a person consider leaving, or when should they leave? What would be grounds to actually, switch churches?
I think the first one that is a good and proper grounds for leaving is if you determine that what the church is teaching is clearly unbiblical. And you may not think that's common. That's very common. I get messages from people. We do a show every Tuesday night where we take questions from people all around the world. And one of the most common questions is, should I leave my church? And they always give the situation they're in. And sometimes it's clear that they shouldn't leave the church. They're upset with somebody in the church, or there's something there going on, and they just need to reconcile. They need to figure out a way to be mature and go to that person and struggle through the difficult times, right? But in other cases, they'll say, well, our pastor just told us that he's non-Trinitarian. Okay, well, that's either that pastor needs to go or you need to go. You can't, that's two men can't walk together if they don't be agreed, right? Yeah. That passage doesn't mean we have to agree on everything, but on the essentials, there must be agreement. So, I mean, I had a guy come to our church one time who the previous church he was in, they hired a youth pastor who was a self-proclaimed anti-Trinitarian. This guy did not believe in the Trinity, and yet he was their now youth pastor, and this guy had kids in the youth group. And he went to the pastor, he says, do you know this guy doesn't believe in the Trinity? He goes, oh, well, he's fine. That was the answer. He's fine. I think that's grounds for the minister to be under some form of discipline. But at the very least, we wouldn't be able to stay if it were my family.
Certainly. So in talking of staying in church, a lot of times, you mentioned there's situations where it might be difficult, but really you should be sticking it out. What is healthy church accountability supposed to look like? And maybe not simply just member to member, somebody hurt your feelings, but how does a congregation hold its leader accountable and the teachings of the church accountable, like what you were just talking about?
Well, I think first you have to have a biblically functioning structure, and that is that you have God-called, biblically qualified elders in the church, not just one figure who runs the church, not just one pastor, not just one, we might call him a Protestant pope, because with that situation, if you've got a guy who's never subject to any form of accountability, then you get yourself in a pretty dangerous situation. So a group of qualified men who are recognized by the congregation to have the biblical qualifications, and who love one another but are also willing to tell one another if they believe that they're wrong. That's an important part. And that is who should be that is where the buck should stop. So if, let's say, there's an issue with something that's being taught in the church, whether it's at the elder level or below the elder level, that should be the group that is addressed. And so if there's an elder who is teaching something false, the other elders have to be able to correct that person, whether that man be the main preaching teacher, pastor, or whether that be one of the other teaching elders. And if there's somebody else in the church who's teaching, maybe there's a Sunday school teacher or a youth leader or somebody who's teaching, there has to be accountability at the elder level, at the pastoral level. And this is one of the areas where, as a Baptist, we don't have a church polity that puts an authority over the church. So like, for instance, in Presbyterian churches, they have a presbytery that can be appealed to. And I understand in one sense how that is how that becomes somewhat of a almost a like people would like that. It would be tempting to want to have a presbytery, because what happens if your elders are askew, right? Do you have anybody over them? But biblically speaking, we don't find a presbytery in the scriptures. We don't find a district assembly or something like that. We have the apostles, but of course, right now we don't have living apostles who are functioning in that way, not in the way that the first church did, or the early church did.
So could I ask you, not to cut you off, but just to clarify, what would an elder be defined as? Is it always pastor? Is it only pastor?
The Bible uses 3 words interchangeably for the same office. So the word pastor is used meaning shepherd.
Right.
Is and the word bishop in the King James, which in the modern translations is overseer, and it's the word in Greek, it's episkopos or episkopos, to overlook or to oversee is the word. And then the word presbyteros, which is the word that we translate as elder. Those 3 words are all used of the same office. The elder, pastor, and bishop are all the same thing. And so, I would say those all are the same category. Now, all elders are not required to be preachers in the sense of not all elders have to be the preaching elder, but all elders have to be able to teach. That's the one qualification that distinguishes them from the deacons. The deacons have almost the same moral qualifications as the elders, but the elders have a very specific functional qualification. They have to be able to teach. Deacons don't have to be able to do that. Deacons have to be able to hold the faith with a clear conscience. They have to know what they believe, but they don't have to be able to teach. Elders have to be able to teach. If not in a public preaching setting, at least in the setting of being able to govern the church with the scriptures. Right. That's part of teaching.
Okay. Got it. All right. So you have talked about on your channel that your church specifically has gone through a few doctrinal changes. Is that right?
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
And obviously, to what you would say is the more appropriately in line with Scripture, those types of doctrinal changes, which is different from what we see most of the time. At least what I see, churches continue to kind of drift off. But what does it look like for a church to change its theology over time in a positive direction? How does that happen?
For us, it was both difficult and beautiful.
Yeah.
But the beauty, like a painting, is not beautiful while it's being painted. It's when you watch someone like I don't know if you remember Bob Ross. When Bob Ross would paint, the painting didn't look beautiful while he was painting it. Often you'd be like, why is he doing that? Or why is he doing this? Or why is he feathering that color or adding in that mix or whatever, because it didn't make sense at the time. But over time you begin to see the beauty of it. So I would say it's beautiful, but in the midst of making the changes, it's very difficult.
Yeah.
And it's difficult because change is always hard, even when you're changing for the better. And so the reason why it's hard is because you'll always have those people who are in the moment very content with the way things are. And as soon as things begin to change, they don't want them to. And usually it has to do with their own either desires for the way things are or their own power structure, because as things begin to change, they may not have the authority or the say or the influence that they once had, and so all those things begin to change. That's kind of that was the battle we faced, was when we began to move in a more reformed direction, when we began to move in a more biblical direction as far as our leadership and elders. The biggest pushback I got was from people who did not want to move away from the model that we had, and we had come out of the old Disciples of Christ churches, which were the very liberal wing of the churches of Christ. So that was where we came from. And I would say the denomination is apostate. And that's why we left the denomination in 1999. We left the Disciples of Christ, and we didn't become Reformed until, a decade later. But that leaving of the denomination was the first step. And then moving into the biblical direction required us to recognize the areas where we needed to change. And one was doctrinally.
Yeah.
But two was also ecclesiastically. We had to change our governing structure, because we still had the model we had before was like, it was like a business. It was very much board driven. We had a general board, we had an executive committee, and then we had a chairman of the board. All of those people were in charge. The pastor was like a low level employee.
Yeah.
The deacons and the elders were like a committee that reported to the board. The board had all the power, and that led to a structure where, because anybody could be on the board, right? The board didn't have biblical qualifications. You didn't have to be the husband of one wife, and you didn't have to be all of the biblical qualifications that go along with being an elder or a deacon. And so we had a board that was made up of women. We had a board that was made up of people who I would say were likely not even believers. Even though they would have professed to be believers, there was no evidence of regeneration in their life. And so that was a huge problem.
Yeah. And a really big switch. So.
Yeah, absolutely. Beautiful, but difficult. Yeah.
How do leaders and maybe members who are on board with, I think we're moving in the right direction, how do they foster that type of change in a church? How do you start that ball rolling? Because like you said, it might be ugly, but slowly it becomes more and more beautiful. How do you foster that in a group of people?
I think the first thing is you have to develop trust. And I remember probably about 15 years ago, I was in a meeting with some other pastors in our area, and there was a pastor there who was really going through a very difficult time with his church. And he was sort of just laying out for us all the problems that he was having. And I said to him, I said, listen, I don't know your context and I don't know your church. I said, but what it sounds like, I said, is it sounds like your people don't trust you. And I said, trust is the capital that ministers operate with. And if you don't build that trust with them by consistency and faithfulness and all of those things that are required for building trust, if you don't build that trust relationship with them, then you're not going to be able to do a whole lot, because they're not going to trust that what you're doing is in their best, for their good and in their best interests. And so I think that the first thing that any minister needs to do is he needs to be willing to sit down with people, be willing to answer questions, be willing not to get angry when questioned. And that's hard for a lot of men. A lot of men, especially men who are sort of, I hate the term alpha, but guys who are just used to being in charge, guys who everywhere they go, they're the captain of the team, right? Like pastors tend to be guys who are like out in front, right? They're used to that. And when people start calling into question what they're saying or what they're doing, sometimes those guys, they can't handle it. They need people to, the answer is yes, sir. That's the only answer I'm listening to is yes, sir. And if you're not willing to actually listen to what people are saying and willingly submit yourself to the inquisition of people who may disagree with you, then you're not going to build a lot of trust.
Yeah.
And so one of the things I did about 2.5 years into my ministry, we had a huge issue that arose over Calvinism.
When did you start?
And there were some people who were 2006. So this would have been mid 2008.
Okay.
We had a issue that arose.
So it had already left the denomination, wasn't really reformed
Yeah.
yet.
This was, we left the denomination in 99.
Right.
So this was way after that. I wasn't a part of that. I got saved that same year.
Okay.
I was 19 years old. Our church left the denomination. I got married and got saved. All three things happened the same year. It's like, I always joke. I say that's like the nexus of my of my universe. It's sort of like in Back to the Future, where November 5th, 1955 was sort of like this benchmark moment for Dr. Emmett Brown. Well, that's my benchmark year, is 99, because the church left the denomination, I got saved, I got married, all in the same year. And 8 years later, or 6 years later, 7 years later, I was the pastor, and I guess it would have been 9 years later, mid 2008, we're going through an issue over Calvinism. And what I did with all the people who had questions is I set up meetings with everybody.
Yeah.
So that they could question me on anything, so that they could ask me anything they wanted to. And I took people to lunch, and I brought people into my office, and I sat down with them. I opened the Bible. I would read a passage, and I would turn the Bible around, and I would push it out in front, and I would say, now read that with me and tell me what you think it means, right? Like, you tell me if you think what I'm saying is right or wrong based on what this says. And I think that level of transparency was very helpful. And I don't think that churches that lack transparency with their people are fostering a atmosphere of trust.
I have so many questions now. One.
Oh, please, yeah.
So when it comes to like the church becoming more reformed, was Calvinism the toughest hurdle?
You would think it was, and those who are, looking back, those who were opposed would probably say Calvinism was the initial issue. But this is why, my book, Biblically Functioning Church, this is why I wrote the book, because I said it wasn't actually Calvinism that was the problem, it was ecclesiology. Because the people that hated Calvinism didn't like the fact that they didn't have control over what was being taught.
Yeah.
And ecclesiastically, they wanted the power to be able to say, you won't teach that. And that is not about Calvinism as much as it is about authority.
Yeah. In their mind, it's Calvinism, but really the underlying issue is that they can't affect change the way they'd like to.
Or the way they used to be able to.
Sure,
See, another thing that happened is there was a couple people, not a lot, but there were a couple people who had always sort of pulled the strings behind the scenes. And at a certain point, when I started standing up to those people and said, you can't, in fact, I remember one guy said, well, you're new around here. I said, sir, I've been here since I was 7. I may only be 2 years into my ministry, but I'm 25 years into this, or 22 years into this church.
Yeah.
I'm not new around here. In fact, right now, and I know this is years later, there's only 5 people in the church that have been there longer than me, and one of them is my mom. So it's like, of a church of 120 people, I've been there the longest. Except
she knows what she's talking about. She says you're
yeah. So that was, there were people who just wanted that authority. And I remember a meeting. This is interesting story. There was a guy who really wanted me to leave, and he said, and I know for a fact that he said this because he told me later that he did say it. But he didn't say it to me. And then initially he said it to somebody else. And then later he said it to me. He said, I'm going to try to find every way I can to get Keith to leave. And that was like he knew he couldn't get me fired. He knew he didn't have the votes to get me fired, but he wanted to make life as hard on me as he could so that I would leave.
Yeah.
And so, and he was a man of authority. He was on the board. He had been at the church forever. He helped build the church. So like this guy had been around forever. And he was upset with me because of Calvinism, but he was also upset with me because he saw his authority eroding.
Yeah. And
so he decided to begin to make things hard on me. And one of the things that he did, this is kind of a dumb side story, but I think it's indicative of the problem. He one day we come to a board meeting, because again, at that point we still had a board, and I still had to attend a monthly board meeting where I was questioned about everything I did. That was always part of the board. The pastor had to give a report. So I came in, I gave my report, and he said to the board, he said, I want a list of everything our pastor does every day. I want an itemized list of what time he wakes up, what time he comes in, what he's working on, who he visits, how long he visits, how much time he spends in prayer. He does this whole list of things. And I said, I'm not going to do it.
Yeah.
And he said, what do you mean you're not going to do it? You're our employee. You'll do what we say. I said, nope. I said, one, you can't make me do it. I said, and two, I said, if I weren't doing the things that you're questioning me on, if I were not visiting people, if I were not studying, if I were not praying, those things would become manifestly obvious within the congregation.
Yeah.
I said, I preach a 45-minute sermon every Sunday. I teach a 50-minute Bible study every Wednesday night. I spend most of my time during the week either traveling to visit people or studying the scriptures. I said, and that's proved by my own work. I said, when my work begins to slip, then you can question me. But until then, you have no right to ask me for this. And everyone agreed. He was wrong. He was just trying to find a way to make my life miserable.
Yeah.
And I said, no, my work speaks for itself. And thankfully at that time there were enough people with sense that they agreed.
So you started really young in that church. You were saved later. Mm-hmm. Were you saved from the preaching of that church?
No. This is where, our church had a lot of problems growing up. As much as I love our church, and I'm thankful that I've been there since I was 7. Our church had a pastor in the 80s that didn't even believe in the virgin birth. Yeah. We had a lot of crazy stuff. I remember a lot of syncretism when I was in high school, going to Sunday school, and they would talk about how different religions all taught the same thing about God, right? There was a lot of crazy stuff in the church. Now, I would say our church was more conservative than most Disciples of Christ churches, but it still had some of that hanging, liberalism. So in 1999, I got confronted for the first time, because I would have said I was a believer, by the way. I got baptized when I was 8. So I would have said I was a believer. In 1999, I met my first real atheist. And this was during the rise of the new atheist movement, guys like Richard Dawkins and Christopher Hitchens and stuff. This was like at the very early part of what they were doing. And I remember sitting next to this atheist at work, and I said something about God, and he said, well, I don't believe in God. I'm too smart to believe in that. And I'd never heard anyone say that. I'd never heard anyone say they were too smart to believe in God. And that affected me. His name was Scott, and Scott's little claim that he was too smart, because he was my friend. He was an ex-science teacher. He had come to work for America Online. I was working for America Online. I went home that day and I opened up my Bible. In fact, I remember very specifically, it was an Action Bible, which is a comic book Bible. Yeah. It just happened to be the Bible I had. And I started looking at the pictures. I saw the picture of Adam and Eve. I saw the picture of Noah and the ark. And then I saw the picture of the burning bush. And when I got to the burning bush, I threw the Bible across the room. I said, this is ridiculous. I can't believe this. At 19 years old, I said to myself, I don't believe this is true. And for the first time, Jordan, I went through a time of absolute severe depression of my heart. I had always been a happy-go-lucky, jovial, funny guy. And I was the most miserable person. And for a couple of weeks, I didn't want to eat. I didn't want to do it. I almost began drinking alcohol, because I had never done that before, but I thought, is that what I need to just make this pain go away? Because I felt the most lost I had ever felt, ever. And I finally remembered there was a guy in my life. His name was Young Smith. And Young had shared the gospel with me a few years before that. And I went to him and talked to him, and he actually led me to Christ. And so it wasn't in my church that I got saved, but as soon as I got saved, I was already married. So my wife had got saved before we got married. I thought I was saved, but I wasn't. Mm-hmm. As soon as I got saved, I went to my wife and I said, we got to start going to church. We have to take God seriously. And the only church I knew was the church I grew up in. My mom, that was my stepmom's church, the one I'm at. My mom also went to churches where she lived, but she lived over an hour away. Yeah. And I never really got into those churches, but the church I grew up in was my church. It was the church we were married in. And so I said, we're going to get serious. We're going to start going to church. And immediately I got very serious about God, very serious about church. And within 2 years, I was confirmed in my call to ministry, and I began seminary.
Nice. Is that where the reason I ask is just wondering how how far behind the church changes were from your own theology being formed in that direction.
Oh, okay. So I actually have that pretty easy timeline for
that. Was
one.
a beautiful testimony, though. I'm not. I was totally locked into
I
that.
appreciate. I love telling that story because the only thing I wish now is I wish I could talk to Scott.
Yeah.
The guy, the atheist, because I have no idea. I don't even remember his last name, but I know we both worked together in America Online 1999. So Scott, if you're out there, if you watch this, please contact me. Reach out, because I'd love to talk to you. It'd be great to hear that he's become a believer. That would be wonderful. But in 99, the church left the denomination. In 2001, I preached my first sermon, and I felt the call to ministry, went into seminary. 2004, I began to be confronted with Reformed theology. So all of that's the timeline. In 2006, I became the pastor. And by that time, I wasn't calling myself a Calvinist. I was still investigating Reformed theology. I was still coming to understand those things. But I believe the gospel. And I was a big Ray Comfort / Billy Graham guy.
Yeah.
Meaning I loved to proclaim the gospel, and I loved to preach the gospel, and I loved to call people to faith in Christ. I was very evangelistic in my preaching. I still think I am, but at that point I was very focused. And but I had also begun listening to John MacArthur, and so my preaching style was more MacArthur-like. It was verse by verse preaching, and so that's what began to move the church more into a Reformed direction, because I'm just preaching the scriptures verse by verse.
Yeah.
And so that's that as far as the timeline, I started becoming more Reformed around 2004, 2005, but it wasn't until 2008 that it became an issue in the church. And the reason why was in 2008, I started teaching in Sunday school. I started teaching through Romans, the book of Romans. And when I got to chapter 3 and chapter 4 on the depravity of man, people began to take issue with that. So that's where kind of the timeline goes.
Okay, awesome. So you're known as the nice guy Calvinist, but I can promise you that there will be people who watch this interview who have no idea what Calvinism is. Their only exposure is internet arguments. And so what I would love for you to do is just explain, what is Calvinism? Calvinism
is a series of, well, let me if I may, let me give a sort of a historical look. In the 16th century, the Protestant Reformation began, and that was where Martin Luther and some other men that we call the early reformers began to take issue with the teachings of the Roman Catholic Church. And out of that, three what are known as magisterial reformers, or reformers who had the authorities behind them. Their magistrates were behind them. So you have Luther in Germany, and you have Zwingli and Calvin in Switzerland. And Calvin was, of the three men, Calvin was the most systematic theologian of the three. He was a profound intellect, and he wrote a what are known as the Institutes of the Christian Religion, which was a systematic theology. He wrote it, I think he was 26 years old when he wrote the first edition of the Institutes.
Which is demoralizing to me.
Yeah, oh, absolutely. Yeah, I mean, and he did that with a quill pen and a candlelight, and it's amazing. But his teachings became very influential in Reformed thinking, and that's why Calvinism is sometimes referred to as Reformed theology. Some people would wonder, well, why is Lutheranism not called Reformed theology, right? It was part of the Reformation too, but Calvinism became so ubiquitous, especially in regard to the influence it had over systematic teaching, that Calvin's teaching was I mean, it became very popularized through his writings and through the writings of those who came after him. And so Calvinism owes its name to the 16th century French reformer. He was French, even though he lived in Switzerland, he had moved there. But he's a French reformer named John Calvin. And today, when somebody calls himself a Calvinist like me, That does not mean that I believe everything that John Calvin taught, but what it does mean is that there is a certain set of theological principles that Calvin taught that I would agree with. And so Calvinism does not mean I worship John Calvin. It doesn't mean that I bow down at the statue of John Calvin or that I believe everything Calvin ever taught. Calvin baptized babies. I don't. I'm a Baptist. So there's one major difference between us. In fact, Calvin would have had me excommunicated because I don't baptize babies. So I understand that my love for Calvin goes one way. He would not have love for Keith Foskey, and I'm okay with that. So today when we talk about Calvinism, we're talking about very specifically the doctrine of man as being bound in sin until such time as God opens his heart to be able to believe. Our sin is so powerful, our depravity so total, that it causes us to be unwilling to obey God or receive the truths of Christ without God opening our heart to do so. We call that the doctrine of total depravity. And that part many people agree with, even people who are not Calvinists would believe.
Because you
that.
have other mechanisms like prevenient grace or other ways they try to answer that issue.
Yeah. But then the next doctrine, and this is sometimes goes by the acrostic TULIP, total depravity, unconditional election, limited atonement, irresistible grace, and the perseverance of the saints. Unconditional election says that God chose actually before any of us were born, even before he laid the foundations of the world, that God chose who he was going to save. And he did so unconditionally, not looking down into my life and seeing something in me that was worthy of saving, but rather, according to his own will, he chose to save me. And that is probably the one doctrine, even though a lot of people would say it's limited atonement or irresistible grace. Unconditional election is the one I find people most offended by. I remember I was in Lifeway bookstore one time, and this was, really early on in my ministry, and I was still studying Calvinism. And I had picked up the book by steal, The 5 Points of Calvinism, and I had purchased it, and I had purchased another book that I was having wrapped. It was a gift, so I had to wait for the book to be wrapped. Well, while that one was being wrapped, I stood back and I was looking at the 5 Points of Calvinism book. Well, a man came and stood next to me, and I knew he wanted to talk to me, but I prayed that he wouldn't, because I just didn't want to have you know what I'm talking about. You've been there, like, oh yeah. Lord, just don't let it, strike this man with mute right now for just the next minute, right? Because I knew he wanted to talk.
Unwillingly, I've become the Calvinist apologist to people, and I've
there it is.
Yeah,
exactly. Well, finally he said, "So what you reading?" And I was like, "Oh." So I showed him the book, and he goes, "Oh, well, what do you think of that?" And I said, well, and at the time I was still in seminary. I said, well, I'm studying it. I'm still in seminary. I'm interested in what the arguments and what it has to say. And he says, oh, well, I don't like that Calvinism stuff. I said, okay. And he said, how did he say? He said, I don't like that limited atonement. No, I'm sorry, I'm telling the story wrong. He said, I don't like Calvinism. I said, okay. He said, I really don't like limited atonement. I said, well, do you believe in hell? And he said, yes. I said, so you do believe some people go to hell? He said, yes. He said, but I believe everybody gets a choice. I said, well, then your problem isn't really with limited atonement. Your problem's with unconditional election. And that was the point I was trying to make, is this whole thing, it's unconditional election is really what bothers people.
That was the hardest for me.
R.C. Sproul tells a great... Yeah, I think ultimately it's the hardest for everybody. Mm-hmm. And R.C. Sproul tells a story one time. He says he taught on total depravity, and he had all of his students sign something saying they agreed with him. It was a chalkboard. He said, come sign the board if you agree, and they all did. Well, the next week he taught unconditional election, and they didn't believe that. And he says, well, if you believe total depravity, then you believe there's nothing we can do. Then you must believe that God's election of us is not based on something we do, but based on him. It must be unconditional. So they all came in one by one. They started erasing their name. They realized they really couldn't affirm total depravity without affirming unconditional election. So it was an interesting story of his. But I say all that simply to say that the system does sort of fit together, because one, it says that we are unable to go to God. So God chooses to come to us. God chooses to whom he comes. And then he sends Christ to save those whom he has chosen. That's the limited atonement part.
Yeah.
Then he draws those who he has chosen effectively to Christ, and those who he draws to Christ, he will empower to persevere until the end. And so that's the simple system of Calvinism, even though I will say right now it's not simple and there are a lot of questions that go with it. And I know your audience who maybe has never heard these things might be like, wow, that's really hard. You know, you've oversimplified a lot. And I have. But the most difficult thing is that God chooses whom will be saved.
Yeah. Well, let me ask you this, because I think for a lot of people who are exposed to Calvinism, having not been in a Calvinist church or among Calvinists, it's a little bit scary. At least it was for me. I felt that my autonomy had been completely violated by these ideas that God would just choose. And then the other side of that is that a lot of people, for some reason, think that Calvinists are mean. You have a funny thing you say, you're not like other Calvinists, you're nice. Why does Calvinism get a bad rap like that? And we're specifically talking to people who maybe they're on that side. I had a comment a few videos ago where somebody said, hey, this video was great, the teaching was great, but your intro had some guys who are Calvinists, and I've heard that Calvinists is evil. And that was the extent of his understanding of Calvinism. He knew that what I was talking about was biblical and it was good, but he was put off by the entire thing because he was afraid that I might be Calvinist.
Well, I think that there is some truth to the stereotypes come from somewhere, right? There's always like stereotypes themselves are not good, but stereotypes don't exist in a vacuum, right? They exist because some kind of something happened, and during the what might be referred to as the Calvinist resurgence, which took place in the early 2000s and really laid hold in the mid to later 2000s. So between 2000 and 2010, there were all these things that were rising up. The Gospel Coalition and Together for the Gospel, Grace to You, Ligonier, right? Yeah. All these things. They started having all these conferences, and there was all this sort of stuff. Well, that gave rise to what's known as the Young, Restless, and Reformed movement. And a lot of those guys who were part of that up-and-coming Calvinism, a lot of them took great pride in the fact that they were going deeper in theology. And therefore, when they would talk to people who maybe weren't going as deep in their theology, there would be a condescension there. There would be a sense of, a sense of pride and arrogance. And that led to a very, very negative caricature of Calvinists in general. And then there was something else, and we're actually seeing this right now, Jordan. We're seeing this with Catholicism and Eastern Orthodoxy, because right now there's been a shift towards Catholicism and Eastern Orthodoxy. I don't know if you're aware of that.
Absolutely.
But that is what you see when a group of young men are fascinated with a position that they consider to be the truth. Oftentimes those young men go through what's known as a cage stage period, and that's where it says they need to be put in a cage because they're dangerous. Yeah. And so there was a cage stage Calvinism that was very popular in the mid 2000s, and now it's a cage stage Catholicism and a cage stage Eastern Orthodoxy, because even some like I've seen recently an Orthodox priest who came out and said, yeah, a lot of these online guys are really not doing us any favors because they're making us look like completely making us look like jerks, right? Yeah. And making us look evil and mean because of their attitude. And I think the same thing happened with Calvinism. I think there were guys. I remember one time I was at a Ligonier conference. I met a guy, young man, and I was a young man too, but we were probably similar in age. We were sitting down on the bench right outside the conference center, and we just got to talking. And he started saying to me I just can't see how everyone can't see these doctrines. It's so obvious. I just can't believe that anybody wouldn't be a Calvinist. I can't believe people be so dumb as to not believe that what Calvinism says is true. It's so obvious. It's right here in the text. And I looked at him and I said, how long have you been a Calvinist? Oh, I became a Calvinist 6 months ago. And I was like,
Yeah.
like, so were you dumb and ignorant and stupid before you? And how? And what kept,
Yeah.
the whole atmosphere, the whole attitude of the guy was, people are just dumb if they don't know this, or if they don't see this, or if they don't agree. And that kind of attitude is poor among Christians to think that way.
Absolutely. Great. So this has been awesome. Our last 10 minutes, I have a ton of questions for you, but really I'm going to get rid of all of them and ask you the question that I really want your opinion on, your help with.
Sure.
So when it comes to God's providence, compatibilism, you've got God's sovereignty and man's responsibility. And one, for people who probably will not know what that is, if you could lay that out, and then I'll get to my question.
Okay. Compatibilism is answering the question of how God determines all things, while at the same time not being responsible for the sinful behavior of people. And that's the answer that's that's the question that's trying to be addressed. And we have on the spectrum of ideas when it comes to man's freedom and God's sovereignty, we have different views. We have what might be called hard determinism. Hard determinism says that God, in his decree of all things, determines all things that are going to be, including our own thoughts. So God's determining everything, even the thoughts and actions of our heart. And that is something that even the Reformed confessions don't believe that. I mean, the Westminster Confession goes out of its way to say that even though God has decreed all things that come to pass, he has done so in such a way that he does not do violence to the will of the creature, nor are secondary causes left out, right?
That's what I thought Calvinism was the first time I was presented with the idea of God being so sovereign. I was like, I'm not a robot.
Yeah. And that is there are people who do believe that, though. Mm-hmm. There are those who hold to what some refer to as hyper-Calvinism. Some call it hard determinism. I remember one time I was doing evangelism at a fair, and a guy came up to me, and I had a booth for our church that was there, and the guy came up and he said, "Why are you doing this?" And I said, "Well, I want to share the gospel with people." He says, "Well, God's going to save these people whether you do this or not. It's not up to you, it's up to God. He's going to save who he wants." And I said, "Are you I forget if I said, are you a primitive Baptist or something?" Because primitive Baptists tend to be hyper-Calvinist. But I asked him, what do you believe? And he said, that little girl right there, he pointed at a little girl, I remember specifically. He said, that little girl is going to get saved whether you tell her about Jesus or not. And I was like, wow. I said, well, you go on down the road and you keep thinking the way you think, and I'm going to keep telling people about Jesus. That's what I said. I said, just go away, because that's not what the Bible tells me to do. Yeah. It doesn't tell me to just go around and hope that people believe. It says to go and actually call people to repentance, urge them to believe, and actually give them reasons to believe, right? That's what I'm called to do. So that's the first one, is hyper-Calvinism or hard determinism. On the other side, we have what's known as libertarian free will. Libertarian free will says that all of our choices come from us, and our will is not determined by anything outside of itself. That's what the idea of libertarian free will. It is truly free from outside, anything outside. All of our will or decisions come from us. And so that would mean that I'm not necessarily bound in sin or unable to believe, because I'm free to do one or the other. I'm free to believe or not to believe, right? Yeah. So a full libertarian free will would have to, on some level, deny total depravity.
Yeah.
So compatibilism says that God is sovereign, and he has decreed all things that come to pass, yet in such a way that I am still responsible for the decisions that I make, and those decisions are legitimate and consequential, meaning I actually do make decisions that are from my own will, and those decisions do have consequences in my life and in the world around me. Yeah. So I am not denying that men have a will. I'm not denying that men make choices that have consequences. But what I am denying as a Calvinist is I am denying that ultimately God is bound by my will, because the opposite is true. I'm actually bound by God's will in the sense that, and I love the way R.C. Sproul said this, he says, I am free, but God is more free than I am. And therefore, when my freedom runs into God's freedom, I lose. Yeah. And so I'm free to do what I want, but I'm not free to thwart the will of God. And I cannot thwart the will of God. That's where I find a great deal of comfort in this, is that I can do what I want, but God will not let me do anything that would thwart his will.
Yeah. This to me was this idea is what I found in scripture that caused me to just kind of throw my hands up and say, okay, that I get it now. I'm a Calvinist. Yeah. So here's my question. What type of place within our daily lives, the way we interact with people, the way we speak, the way we might comfort somebody through a hard time, what type of place does language like God allowed something to happen play versus should we say that at all? Because I know the way some people say it's not biblical, but is there any place for that type of language, or how would we comfort somebody through a hard thing that maybe they say, how could God allow this to happen? Or I've heard people say God didn't allow, or God didn't want that, he just allowed it. He wasn't actually in charge. They get down that road to remove God from being culpable for something, which God can't be culpable for evil, but he does seem to take credit for basically everything.
Yeah, this is actually a great question because I have, in recent years, I have warmed up to the idea of using the word allowance or permission on God's part. Not just because it's softer and easier, but I do think there's a biblical I think there are some biblical parameters for that.
Yeah.
One, when we say that God permits something, God does not permit anything that he does not have a purpose for. So when people say, well, God has a perfect will and a permissive will, I say, no, God has a perfect will, and his perfect will does include his permitting of certain actions on our part because he has a purpose for them. And therefore you could say God has a purposeful will. And so let me give you the example. In the book of Job, we know that there's a scene Job is unaware of. By the way, I always love to point out the fact that when all this is happening in heaven and Satan is presenting himself before God, and there's this moment of, Satan is accusing Job, and he wouldn't love you if you didn't give him everything, and take everything away, and he won't love you anymore. All that scene, Job is blissfully unaware that any of that's happening, right? Like that's happening without him. And God permits, if we will, that term, Satan to have a certain amount of ability that he didn't have before, because before he couldn't touch Job. Yeah. He didn't have the right to do anything to Job. And so I look at that and I say, there's an example of God giving permission to something because he had a purpose in it.
Yeah.
And so I don't have a problem with that language so much so far as we don't say what you said earlier, and this is key, that God didn't have any control over it. That's the part that I cannot abide that. There was a book that came out a few years ago. It was entitled Why Bad Things Happen to Good People. And if I remember correctly, it was written by a Jewish man. And his ultimate answer in the book was the reason bad things happen to good people is because, and it always, if I remember correctly, is his son had died, and he was trying to find an answer to it. And his ultimate answer was there are just some things God doesn't control.
Yeah, that's
There's just
tragic.
some things God doesn't have. Oh, absolutely. I think it's heartbreaking to come to that conclusion, but that was the conclusion he came to, was that there are
Yeah.
just some things God doesn't have control over. Some things are just gonna happen, and God's not in control. And the problem with that is now you end up with a God who is able to be thwarted
Yeah.
either by our will or by circumstance. This is what R.C. Sproul meant when he said there is not one rogue molecule in the universe.
Yeah.
He wasn't saying that God is meticulously controlling everybody's behavior and everything. What he's saying is there's not one molecule in the universe that doesn't ultimately have its being in God. So God is able to thwart or stop or destroy that one molecule if in such a way that molecule was going to bring about the thwarting of his plan.
Yeah.
And so I look at it like this, and this is a, I don't want to go too long on this, but this is usually very helpful for people. How many things were required for Jesus Christ to be put on the cross, and
The
how
world
many
couldn't contain the
actions-
books.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
If you walk through just the things we know, there were 6 different kangaroo courts that he went through.
Yeah.
He was taken to the house of Annas. He was taken to the house of Caiaphas. He was taken before the Sanhedrin. He was taken before Pilate once. He was taken before Herod once. He was taken before Pilate again. That's 6 courts
Yeah.
where at any moment, any one of them could have set him free, and yet they did not. And if you remember in the book of Acts, Peter is talking about what happened to Jesus, and he said this took place because your hand predestined it to occur.
Yeah.
Like
That's a
God
verse
had
I go to.
determined.
And what you said, where you read it and then you have them read it and just say, what does that mean? That's one that I go to
That's right.
often, because how else do you answer that? And one of the answers I got
Exactly.
recently was, well, I see that God is sovereign over the lives of these people in the Bible. It looks like it's very clear to me that he was orchestrating everything going on in the life of John the Baptist, but he's not doing that to me. And I just found that funny.
I have a great answer for that if you'd like to hear
Sure,
it.
absolutely.
This is, are you familiar with the butterfly effect?
Yeah.
Okay, so you know the concept. Well, for those who don't know, those who may be watching, the butterfly effect is the idea that a butterfly flaps its wings in South America and a hurricane hits Florida, right? Because one thing triggered the other, but it's such a small triggering that it's infinitesimally small, but it does affect the whole, right? There's actually a joke. This is actually from the television show The Simpsons. So forgive me if mentioning The Simpsons is if your audience gets upset. But there's an episode when I was a kid, I was watching it. Homer Simpson got sent back in time, and he steps on a bug. Then he goes forward in time again, and he comes back, and his whole life is different because he stepped on one bug. And it's like such a silly thing, but that's the idea. Is like one small thing can affect everything else. If and I know this sounds crazy, but stick with me, Jordan. I would not be alive if we had not dropped the atomic bomb on Hanoi. Because if that hadn't have happened, so many other things would be different in our history. So many other things would be different today, that it's very possible that the entire line of people that existed out of my family, and I'm thinking of my family that fought in World War II, right?
Yeah.
My whole life would have been different, and it very much is possible I wouldn't even be alive today.
Yeah.
If that one historic event had not taken place, I might not even exist. I wouldn't exist because it would be a different world. This is the whole multiverse thing. Like everybody gets into the Marvel Cinematic Universe, gets into the multiverse. I know I'm getting a little nerdy here, but you seem like the kind of guy who can handle it. So if you think about how many things that take place every day that go into just our own existence all around the world, right? And how much our existence is dependent on other things, to say that God ordained, I said this to a guy one time and he laughed, but then he thought about it and he agreed with me. I said, if God has predestined any single event. He has to have predestined all of the events that go up into that event, and therefore he must have predestined all the events that go into those events,
Well,
and therefore
I
all
didn't
things
know
are
where
under
you were
his
going
sovereign
with
hand.
this, but as you were talking, I was thinking, if he predestined, if he elected certain people before the foundations of the world, then everything else has to be, in some sense, also part of his foreknowledge and his providence and the way he's doing things. Or else, how else does he get to you that he elected?
Psalm 139 says not only did he form us in the womb, but it also tells us that he has written in his book our days that were fashioned before us before there was even one of them. Like, God has determined that. If God has determined that, then he had to determine the things that brought you about, which was,
absolutely.
9 months before I was born, there was some interaction between my parents that had to take place, right? Like, even that.
Yeah.
And so you get where I'm coming from. Hopefully
Absolutely.
your audience will as well.
Yeah, I think so. Brother, I'm so thankful to have spoken with you and talked to you, and for you being willing to do this. For everybody who's watching, I commented in your live stream and asked if you would do this, and you said absolutely, for $500 and the rights to your firstborn, which was not true. He did it for absolutely free. So I'm just so grateful for you doing that and for answering these questions. And then you were talking about your book. If you want to share those things and where people can go watch you, and maybe a quick minute about Church Soup, because that is hilarious. I'd love for people to go see that.
Sure. Yeah. So our channel is Your Calvinist, Y-O-U-R, Calvinist. And you can find there, we have several different ongoing shows. One that Jordan was just talking about is our Tuesday night show, where we do questions from all around the world. And you can interact with us live, or you can send us questions into our website, keithfoskey.com. I also do a show called Church Soup. It is the greatest evangelical news show in the history of the internet, according to my mom. And it is, it's my favorite thing to do, because I get to go and make jokes about all of the silly things that happen in and around church life. So I encourage people to check that out. It comes out just about every 2 weeks. Sometimes I have to push it out to 3 weeks, but we try to make it a bi-weekly show, and encourage people to go and check it out.
Awesome. And everything will be linked down below. Your book?
Yes. The book is called Biblically Functioning Church. It's put out by Grace and Truth Press. It is on Amazon. It's available right now for $9.99, so it's not super expensive. And it's a great manual for how the church should function, and also how you as a church member, if you're not a pastor or an elder, how you as a church member can better help your church be a church that's seeking to follow after Christ in the way that he commands us to do.
Awesome. Brother, thank you so much. I really appreciate it, and I'll see you guys next time.